Cairo has a long history of political protest. The history of protest, however, is often written later and is shaped by official narratives of power. In Egypt's latest wave of protests since the beginning of the 2011 revolution, there has been a recurring theme in public space, particularly in Tahrir Square, the symbolic center of the revolution. The Revolution Museum, a temporary structure built of wooden supports and plastic sheets for walls, has appeared multiple times at the epicenter of the square until it gets removed when the square is cleared by force. The museum is a conscious response by anonymous protesters to the process of writing history. It is an attempt by protesters to create a space where messages, sentiments, objects, and images from the protests can be kept and displayed as a record of the unfolding events. There have been many protests in the years leading up to the 2011 events, but the history of those protests remains at the margins of official narratives. Similarly, when Egypt went through a major moment of transition in 1952 during the coup d'etat or revolution of that year, the role of protests was marginalized in the official narrative constructed by the ruling regime following those events. A 1953 article published in a popular magazine asked, "Where is the people's share in the Revolution Museum?" Tahrir Square's Revolution Museum is a spatial manifestation of the Egyptian protesters' desire not only to enact change by taking to the streets, but also to ensure their right to history. During the occupation of Tahrir Square in 2011, protesters began to post their protest signs on one of the walls bordering the square. Soon, protesters began to write messages and draw cartoons reflecting in the moment of revolution. A museum of the revolution began to emerge on the side of the square. During the subsequent sit-ins and protests in Tahrir Square, the Museum of the Revolution took on a quasi-institutional frame, as it now had a signed entrance, walls, and a desk where volunteers managed the space. Tahrir Square's Revolution Museum in July 2013 was located at the center of the square. Here, protesters entered the temporary structure to view as well as to create and curate displays. Items on display are mostly anonymous, with the exception of the occasional sign, drawing, or message. The items are then mediated to audiences beyond those occupying the space via mobile devices. Here, a man captures a photo of a sign which reads, "Egypt is in danger, no to preventing the media from performing its task." The unfinished museum of the 1952 revolution was commissioned by former President Hosni Mubarak in 1997. Located across the Nile from Tahrir Square, it was meant to present the official narrative which memorializes the role of military officers rather than protesters during the events of the 1952 revolution or coup d'etat. Tahrir's Revolution Museum is an important feature of Egyptian protests that combines political activism, conceptions of citizenship, uses of public space, and notions of the institution of a museum as an archive. The ephemeral but recurrent Museum of the Revolution is a clear response to the constant belittling in the official narrative of the role of protesters in the making of history.